Hello, dear friends. Welcome to Tales from WW2 Jungle. Tonight is special. We have two terrifying true stories for you. World War II ended in 1945, but some mysteries from that war have never been solved. Some places still carry the echoes of what happened there. Tonight, you'll hear about American soldiers who faced something beyond normal combat, something unexplainable. Something that still exists today. First, the Ghost Sentinels of Oregon. Phantom Japanese soldiers appearing on American soil, replaying battles from thousands of miles away. Second, the Ghost Bomber of the Rockies, a training aircraft that crashed in the mountains and never stopped flying. These are stories the military classified. Stories that challenge everything we think we know about reality. Turn down your lights. Get comfortable. The mysteries begin now. December 1942. The Oregon coast had become America's front line. My name is Jack Sullivan, and I was 23 years old when they stationed our unit along the wind-swept cliffs overlooking the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor was still fresh in everyone's mind. Just 1 year had passed. Command feared a Japanese invasion might come from anywhere, and the rugged coastline of Oregon seemed vulnerable, exposed. We were 10 men total. Our assignment was simple: patrol the beaches and forested ridges, watch for enemy submarines, and report anything unusual. The military had set up observation posts every few miles along the coast. Ours was near a place the locals called Devil's Elbow, a sharp curve where the cliffs dropped 200 feet straight into the churning ocean below. The shifts were brutal. 2 men on watch, 4 hours at a time, day and night. My partner was Eddie Richardson from Ohio, a quiet farm boy with steady nerves. We drew the midnight to 4 shift most nights. The fog would roll in thick as wool. You couldn't see 20 feet in front of you. Just the sound of waves crashing against rocks far below, and the wind howling through the coastal pines. It got into your head after a while, that constant noise. Made you imagine things. The first incident happened on our 3rd week. Eddie and I were making our rounds along the cliff trail when we saw the lights. Not the beam of a lighthouse, these were smaller, moving erratically through the trees about 100 yards inland. Orange and flickering, like torches or lanterns. "You seeing this?" Eddie whispered. I nodded, my hand moving to my rifle. Could be smugglers, or civilians who don't know there's a blackout order. But something felt wrong. The lights moved in formation, deliberate and purposeful, heading north along the ridgeline. We counted at least 6 separate sources. "Should we call it in?" Eddie asked. "Let's get closer first. Confirm what we're looking at." We moved inland, following the lights through the dense forest. The Douglas firs blocked out what little moonlight penetrated the fog. Our boots crunched on wet needles and broken branches, way too loud for proper stealth. But the lights kept moving ahead of us, always maintaining the same distance. After 10 minutes of pursuit, we reached a small clearing. The lights had vanished completely. Eddie swept his flashlight across the area. Nothing. No footprints in the soft earth. No broken branches. No sign anyone had been there at all. Just fog and darkness and the distant sound of the ocean. "Jack," Eddie said slowly, "this doesn't make sense." We searched for another 20 minutes before returning to our post. When we reported the incident to Sergeant Morrison during the morning briefing, he didn't seem surprised. "You two are the 3rd pair to report lights in the forest this month," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Command thinks it might be signal flares from enemy agents, but we've never found evidence. Keep your eyes open and report anything else unusual." That's when I should have known something was deeply wrong with this place. The following week, the encounters intensified. 2 other pairs on patrol, Hayes and Cooper on the southern section, and Miller and Davis near the lighthouse. Both reported seeing figures moving through the coastal scrub brush just before dawn, figures wearing what looked like military uniforms, but moving silently. Impossibly silent, through terrain that should have made noise. Hayes swore he saw an entire squad, maybe 8 or 9 men, ascending a steep ravine that led from the beach to the forest. He challenged them verbally, as protocol demanded. No response. He fired a warning shot into the air. The figures didn't react, just kept climbing in single file. By the time Hayes and Cooper reached the ravine, there was no one there. No footprints in the sand. Nothing disturbed. They moved like ghosts, Hayes told us during an emergency unit meeting. His hands were shaking as he spoke. Like they were floating up that hill. Sergeant Morrison was less patient this time. You men are letting your imaginations run wild. This is enemy territory watch, not a ghost hunting expedition. Stay focused on actual threats, submarines, aircraft, saboteurs, not shadows and lights. But Morrison didn't sound entirely convinced. I could see it in his eyes. Eddie and I drew patrol again that night. The fog was even thicker than usual, reducing visibility to almost nothing. We stayed close to our observation bunker, a reinforced position with a clear view of the beach below. Around 2 a.m., Eddie grabbed my arm. Listen. I strained my ears. Beneath the wind and waves, I heard it. Voices, distant but distinct, speaking in a language I didn't understand. Japanese. My blood went cold. That's coming from the beach, Eddie whispered. They're landing. We grabbed our rifles and moved to the cliff edge, peering down through the fog. The voices continued, multiple speakers, seemingly having a conversation. But we couldn't see anyone. The beach below was empty, just dark sand and white foam from the breaking waves. The voices grew louder, closer. It sounded like they were climbing the cliff face directly beneath us. Eddie aimed his rifle downward, finger on the trigger. Identify yourself, he shouted into the darkness. The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence except for the ocean. We waited, weapons ready, hearts pounding. Minutes passed. Nothing emerged from below. Eventually, we used our flashlights to scan the cliff face. There was no one there. The rock wall was too steep to climb without equipment anyway. It would have been a suicide mission. What the hell is happening here? Eddie's voice cracked slightly. I didn't have an answer. Nothing in our training had prepared us for this. When dawn finally came, we examined the cliff base at low tide. No landing craft marks in the sand. No rope marks on the rocks. No footprints. Nothing. Sergeant Morrison filed a report with command, but I could tell he was rattled now. We all were. This wasn't just imagination or nerves anymore. Something was actively manifesting on this stretch of coast, and none of us understood what it was. That night, Morrison changed the patrol assignments. From now on, we'd work in groups of 3 instead of 2. Safety in numbers, he said. But I think he was just afraid to have his men isolated with whatever was out there in the fog. February 1943. The incidents had become routine, almost expected. Every few nights, someone would report the lights in the forest, or the shadow figures, or the disembodied voices speaking Japanese. We'd investigate, find nothing, and file another report that command probably threw away without reading. The locals in the nearby town of Florence knew something was wrong. Some of the older fishermen refused to work the waters near our position anymore. When we'd go into town on rare leave days, people would look at us with a mixture of pity and fear. One elderly woman at the general store pulled me aside once. That land is troubled, she said quietly. The native tribes avoided those cliffs, called them the waiting place. Said spirits of warriors who died violently would gather there, unable to move on. I thanked her politely but didn't give it much credence at the time. We were rational soldiers dealing with a potential enemy threat, not superstitious locals worried about tribal legends. But then came the night that changed everything. Eddie, Morrison, and I were on patrol together. The sergeant had started joining the shifts personally. It was just past midnight when we all saw them simultaneously. An entire platoon of soldiers emerged from the tree line about 50 yards ahead of us. They wore distinctive helmets and uniforms. Japanese Imperial Army, unmistakable even in the dim light. They moved in perfect formation, weapons at the ready, advancing directly toward our position. "Contact!" Morrison shouted, raising his rifle. "Enemy troops, 12 o'clock." We all took firing positions behind a fallen log. My training kicked in. Identify target, aim center mass, prepare to fire. But something made me hesitate. The Japanese soldiers weren't reacting to us. They didn't take cover, didn't aim their weapons at us, didn't even seem to see us. They just kept advancing in that perfect formation, steady and mechanical. "Fire!" Morrison ordered. We opened up, our rifles cracking in the night air. I aimed carefully, squeezed the trigger, watched my sights align on the lead soldier. But my bullets passed straight through him. No impact, no reaction, nothing. Like shooting at smoke. The entire platoon walked right through our position. I felt a coldness wash over me as they passed. Not the cold of winter air, but something deeper, something that touched my bones. One soldier passed within 2 feet of me, and I could see his face clearly. Young, maybe 19 or 20. His eyes were empty, looking at something far away that I couldn't see. Then they were gone, simply faded into the fog behind us, heading toward the cliff edge. We spun around, weapons ready, but there was nothing there anymore. Just the empty night and the sound of the ocean. Morrison was breathing hard, his rifle still raised. Eddie had gone pale, his lips moving but no sound coming out. "That did not just happen," Morrison finally said. "That did not just happen." But it had. We'd all seen it, all fired our weapons at it, all felt that unnatural cold. We stood there until dawn, too shaken to continue patrol, too afraid to leave our position. When the sun finally rose and burned away the fog, we found our spent shell casings scattered on the ground. Physical evidence that we'd fired our weapons. But there were no bodies, no blood, no sign of any enemy soldiers, living or dead. Command finally took us seriously after Morrison filed his report. They sent an intelligence officer, Captain Warren from the OSS, to investigate. He arrived 3 days later with a small team and a skeptical attitude. "Gentlemen, I understand you've been under considerable stress," Warren began his briefing. "Extended isolation, harsh conditions, constant vigilance. These factors can create shared hallucinations, especially among tired soldiers." "With respect, sir," Morrison interrupted, "this isn't fatigue or imagination. Multiple trained observers have witnessed these phenomena repeatedly. Something is happening here that doesn't fit standard explanations." Warren smiled thinly. "I'm here to determine exactly what that something is. Natural explanations first, supernatural speculation last." He spent a week with us, observing our patrols, examining the locations where incidents had occurred. He brought scientific equipment, cameras, audio recording devices, even a Geiger counter to test for possible radiation that might cause hallucinations. The first 3 nights were quiet. Nothing unusual happened, and I could see Warren's skepticism hardening. He was preparing to dismiss our reports as group hysteria. Then on the 4th night, the phenomena returned with unprecedented intensity. Warren insisted on joining Eddie and me on patrol. We were positioned at our usual observation point when the lights appeared, but this time, there were dozens of them, stretching along the ridgeline like a column of torches. "I see them," Warren said quietly, his scientific detachment cracking slightly. "I actually see them." He tried to photograph them, but every picture came out blank, just fog and darkness. The recording equipment captured only static and the ambient sounds of wind and waves. Then the voices started. Not just Japanese this time, We heard American voices too, shouting orders, calling for medics, screaming in pain. The sounds of battle overlaid the peaceful coastal night like a radio tuned to the wrong frequency. Warren's face had gone white. He was a trained intelligence officer, likely exposed to numerous strange situations. But this was beyond his experience. "This is impossible," he muttered, checking his equipment. "The audio recordings show nothing. The cameras show nothing. But we're all perceiving the same phenomena." The shadow soldiers appeared next, 2 separate groups this time. The Japanese platoon we'd seen before, still in perfect formation, moving through the trees. But now there was a second group, American soldiers, also in formation, also translucent and unreal, moving perpendicular to the Japanese unit. They passed through each other without any sign of contact. 2 phantom armies, occupying the same space but existing in different realities. "My God," Warren whispered. "They're reenacting something, over and over." Eddie spoke up, his voice hoarse. "But sir, there was never a battle here. No Japanese troops ever landed on the Oregon coast during the war. We've held this line without engagement." Warren nodded slowly. "Not here, not yet. But somewhere, these men fought, these men died, and somehow, their final moments are being projected onto this location." He pulled out a map, studying it by flashlight. "The trajectory of the Japanese unit. They're moving northeast, inland. If you extend that line across the Pacific," his finger traced a path, "it leads back to the Philippines, Bataan Peninsula. And the American unit, they're heading southwest, toward the ocean. The same battlefield, opposite sides." "The Bataan Death March happened months ago," Morrison said. "Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers died there." Warren looked up at us, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen in an officer before. Genuine fear. "Gentlemen, I don't have an explanation for this. What you're experiencing falls outside current scientific understanding. But I believe you. This is real, or at least, it's a real phenomenon, even if we can't explain the mechanism." After Warren's visit, we began documenting everything systematically. Dates, times, exact locations, descriptions, weather conditions. Patterns started to emerge. The phenomena occurred most frequently during foggy conditions, always at night, and specifically during the hours between midnight and 4 a.m., the darkest, coldest part of the night. The Japanese phantom soldiers always moved in the same direction, following the same route. The lights in the forest appeared in a consistent pattern. The voices spoke the same phrases, over and over. Miller, who had been a school teacher before the war, started researching the local history. He discovered something disturbing in the library at Florence. "I found records from the local Native American tribes," he told us during a meeting. "The Siuslaw people had legends about this area. They called it the place where warriors dream. They believed that when soldiers died with unfinished business, their spirits would travel to certain locations, places of power or transition, and replay their final battles." "But why here?" Hayes asked. "Why this specific stretch of Oregon coast?" Miller shrugged. "The legends say it's because this is a liminal space, a boundary between ocean and land, life and death. The tribes performed ceremonies here to help warrior spirits find peace. But those ceremonies haven't been performed in decades." Morrison lit a cigarette, thinking, "So we're dealing with some kind of psychic imprint? Ghosts replaying their deaths?" "Not ghosts exactly," Miller said. "More like echoes, reverberations of traumatic events so intense they've somehow left marks on reality itself. The men who died at Bataan both American and Japanese. They died violently, suddenly, with their missions incomplete. Their final moments were so powerful that they're bleeding through to other locations across the Pacific Theater. It was an unsettling theory, but it fit what we were experiencing better than any other explanation. Captain Warren returned 2 weeks later with new orders from command. The brass had decided our reports were credible enough to warrant keeping the base operational, but they'd classified everything under the highest security protocols. We were forbidden from discussing the phenomena with anyone outside our unit. The military doesn't officially believe in ghosts, Warren explained, but they do believe in unexplained phenomena that might be weaponized by the enemy. Command is concerned that if the Japanese learn about what's happening here, they might try to exploit it somehow, create panic, spread rumors, undermine morale. So we're supposed to just keep watching phantom soldiers march through our position every night? Eddie asked. You're supposed to maintain security protocols and continue your mission, Warren said firmly. If there are actual Japanese forces in the area using these phenomena as cover for real operations, you need to be able to distinguish between the supernatural and the genuine threat. It was a reasonable order, but it was taking a toll on all of us. The lack of sleep, the constant tension, the knowledge that we were experiencing something beyond normal reality. It wore on your mind. Hayes started having nightmares. Cooper developed a nervous tic. Even Morrison, our rock-solid sergeant, seemed more haggard with each passing week. But we stuck to our duties. Because that's what soldiers do. Even when we're guarding a stretch of coast haunted by the ghosts of battles fought thousands of miles away. March, 1943. We'd been stationed on the Oregon coast for 4 months. The phantom manifestations had become almost routine, disturbing, but expected. Then everything changed on the night of the full moon. The evening started normally. Eddie and I drew patrol with Morrison again. The fog was lighter than usual, and bright moonlight illuminated the coastal landscape with an eerie silver glow. We could see clearly for once, the beach below, the forest behind us, the ocean stretching endlessly to the horizon. Around 1 a.m., all three of us felt it simultaneously. A change in the air pressure, a sudden drop in temperature, a sensation like static electricity crawling across our skin. Something's different tonight, Morrison said quietly. He was right. The phantom soldiers appeared as usual, the Japanese platoon emerging from the forest, the American unit moving from the opposite direction. But this time, they weren't translucent. They looked solid, real, detailed in a way we'd never seen before. We could see individual faces, expressions, even the mud on their boots. And for the first time since these phenomena began, they seemed aware of each other. The two groups stopped when they came within 20 yards of each other. The commanders, one Japanese officer, one American lieutenant, stepped forward. They appeared to be communicating, though we heard no words. The tension in the air was palpable. "What are they doing?" Eddie whispered. "I think they're negotiating," Morrison replied. "Or saying goodbye. Or, I don't know." The two officers bowed to each other, a gesture of respect between warriors. Then they returned to their units. Both groups turned 90 degrees and began marching together, side by side, toward the cliff edge. "Should we stop them?" I asked, knowing how absurd the question was. Morrison shook his head. "They're not really here, Jack. We can't stop them. We can only witness." The combined group of phantom soldiers, American and Japanese together, marched steadily toward the 200-foot drop. They didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. They simply walked forward in perfect formation and stepped off the cliff into empty space. We rushed to the edge, looking down. There was nothing below, no bodies, no sign of impact. just waves crashing against rocks in the moonlight. "They've moved on," Morrison said quietly. "Whatever was holding them here, whatever unfinished business kept them trapped, it's resolved now." And he was right. After that night, the phenomena ceased completely. No more lights in the forest, no more shadow soldiers, no more disembodied voices. The stretch of coast that had been haunted for months fell silent. Captain Warren returned one final time to interview us and collect our final reports. We told him everything we'd witnessed that night. "The military will never officially acknowledge what happened here," Warren said. "But unofficially, I want you men to know that your service has been invaluable. You've documented something extraordinary, something that challenges our understanding of reality itself." "Do you think they were really ghosts, sir?" Eddie asked. Warren considered the question carefully. "I think that men who die violently, with purpose unfulfilled, leave impressions on the world. Whether those impressions are spiritual, psychological, or something else entirely, I honestly don't know. But I believe what you saw was real in a way that matters." Chapter: May 1945. The war ended. We returned home to a country celebrating victory, trying to rebuild and move forward. But some of us couldn't forget what we'd witnessed on that Oregon coast. Eddie and I stayed in touch after the war. We'd meet for coffee sometimes, in diners and cafes around the country, and talk about those months in 1942 and 1943. "Do you still think about it?" Eddie asked me once, in 1947, in a small restaurant in Chicago. "Every day," I admitted. "It changed how I see the world, made me realize there are layers to reality we don't understand." Eddie nodded. "I went back there once, to the coast, drove up from California last year, stood on those cliffs where we used to keep watch. What did you find?" "Nothing. It was just a beautiful stretch of coastline, peaceful, quiet, no trace of what we experienced." He paused, stirring his coffee. "But the locals remember. The Siuslaw people still won't fish those waters. They say the spirits have moved on, but the place is still sacred, still a boundary between worlds." Morrison passed away in 1952. Heart attack, the doctors said. But I always wondered if those months of stress and fear on that isolated coast had taken their toll on him earlier than it should have. Of the original 10 men in our unit, I lost track of most of them over the years. Hayes moved to Alaska and became a pilot. Cooper returned to his farm in Iowa. Davis went to college on the GI Bill and became an engineer. Miller, the school teacher, went back to his classroom and never spoke about the war. As for the official records, they remain classified. Captain Warren told us that command had decided the phenomena constituted a potential national security matter, and all documentation was sealed indefinitely. As far as the military is concerned, nothing unusual ever happened on the Oregon coast during World War II. But we know better. We were there. We witnessed something that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding. Phantom soldiers from battles fought thousands of miles away, manifesting on American soil, reenacting their final missions over and over, until somehow, impossibly, they found resolution. I'm 78 years old now as I record this testimony in 1997. Most of the men who served with me on that coast are gone. Soon, I'll be gone too, and our story will fade into history. But before that happens, I wanted to leave this account. Not for military records or academic study, but for anyone who might experience something similar in the future. The world is stranger than we've been taught to believe. There are boundaries between life and death, between past and present, that aren't as solid as we think. Places where traumatic events leave permanent marks. Locations where the veil between realities grows thin. I learned on that Oregon coast that soldiers who die with their duty unfulfilled don't always rest easy. They carry their missions beyond death, seeking completion, seeking purpose, seeking peace. And sometimes, just sometimes, that peace comes from an unexpected source. From former enemies recognizing each other as fellow warriors. From respect and honor transcending the causes they fought for. The Ghost Sentinels of Oregon taught me that lesson, and I've carried it with me every day since 1943. War creates ghosts, both living and dead. The dead ones are easier to understand. They're trapped in the moment of their deaths, replaying their final actions endlessly. But the living ghosts, soldiers like Eddie and Morrison and me, who witnessed the impossible and had to keep serving despite our fear, we're trapped too, in our own way. Haunted by memories of things we can't explain and aren't allowed to discuss. So if you're listening to this story late at night, maybe on some lonely watch of your own, remember this. The world is full of mysteries. Some soldiers guard borders between nations. Others, without ever knowing it, guard borders between realities. We were the Ghost Sentinels. We stood watch on the edge of the explainable world, and we bore witness to something that changed us forever. February 1943, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. My name is Thomas Webb, and I was a flight instructor at Peterson Field in Colorado Springs. We were training bomber crews, young men barely out of high school, learning to fly massive B-24 Liberators through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. The Rockies were brutal training grounds. Unpredictable weather, violent updrafts, sudden storms that could appear in minutes. But command believed that if crews could navigate these mountains, they could handle anything the European theater would throw at them. On February 17th, we lost a plane. Lieutenant Marcus Chen was piloting a B-24 Liberator on what should have been a routine navigation exercise. His crew consisted of 9 men: co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, and 4 gunners. Good men, experienced for their age. They'd flown this route a dozen times before. The weather forecast called for clear skies. Chen took off at 0900 hours with instructions to follow a predetermined course through several mountain passes, practice high-altitude navigation, then return to base by 1300 hours. They never came back. At 1400 hours, when the plane was officially overdue, we initiated search protocols. Radio silence. No distress calls. No emergency transponder signals. The B-24 had simply vanished into the mountains. Search and rescue teams deployed immediately. We sent up spotter planes, contacted ranger stations, alerted mountain climbing clubs. The Air Force dedicated significant resources to finding that bomber, both for the crew's sake and because a B-24 represented substantial military investment. For 3 weeks, we searched. The winter weather fought us every day. Snowstorms, whiteouts, temperatures dropping to 30 below zero. We covered hundreds of square miles of mountainous terrain. Found nothing. No wreckage, no debris field, no parachutes, no signs of crash or fire. 10 men and a 4-engine bomber had disappeared as completely as if they'd flown into another dimension. Eventually, command called off the active search. The official report listed Lieutenant Chen and his crew as missing in action, presumed dead due to aircraft accident in mountainous terrain. Their families received the standard condolence letters. The incident was filed away as another tragic training accident in a war full of tragedies. But I couldn't let it go. I'd known Chen personally, had been his primary flight instructor. He was cautious, skilled, not the type to take unnecessary risks. Something about the disappearance felt wrong. I started asking questions. talked to the meteorology team about that day's weather conditions, reviewed radar logs, interviewed other pilots who'd flown similar routes. And I discovered something unusual. 3 other pilots reported strange occurrences in that same general area over the previous 6 months. Visual anomalies, compass malfunctions, radio interference that sounded almost like voices speaking in patterns that didn't match normal static. One pilot described it as the mountain swallowing sound. None of these incidents had been serious enough to warrant official investigation. Just odd notes in flight logs that most people dismissed as equipment glitches or pilot error. But taken together, they suggested something unusual about that particular section of the Rockies. I requested permission to conduct ground reconnaissance of the area where Chen's plane had likely gone down. Command approved. They probably figured it would give me closure and get me to stop pestering them with questions. So in late March, when the weather improved slightly, I joined a small search team heading into the high country. We were 4 men, myself, a ranger named Bill Morrison, and 2 experienced mountaineers, Frank Dietrich and Sam Kovacs. We planned to spend a week searching the most likely crash zones, steep valleys and ridge lines where a plane caught in sudden weather might have gone down. None of us expected to find what we did, or rather what we didn't find. We established base camp at 9,000 feet, in a sheltered valley the locals called Devil's Canyon. The name should have been a warning. Bill Morrison, our ranger guide, knew these mountains better than anyone. He'd been working in the Rockies for 20 years, had seen every kind of weather and terrain challenge imaginable. There's something off about this area, he told us the first night around the campfire. Wildlife avoids it. You notice we haven't seen any deer sign? No elk tracks? Even the birds seem scarce here. Frank Dietrich, the older of our 2 mountaineers, nodded. I've climbed all over these ranges. This valley always felt wrong to me. Can't explain it better than that. I chalked it up to the isolation and the grim nature of our mission. We were searching for dead men, after all. The psychological weight of that colors your perception. The next morning, we split into 2 teams. Morrison and I would search the northern ridgeline while Dietrich and Kovacs covered the southern approach. We'd rendezvous back at camp by 1700 hours. The weather was clear, cold but stable. Perfect conditions for our search. Morrison and I climbed steadily, scanning the snowfields and cliff faces for any sign of wreckage. The sun was bright, the visibility excellent. If there was anything to find, we should have spotted it. Around noon, we stopped for lunch on a rocky outcrop with a commanding view of the valley. That's when I heard it. The sound of aircraft engines. Distant but distinct. 4 engines running in synchronization. The unmistakable drone of a heavy bomber. Morrison heard it too. You hear that? I nodded, scanning the sky. Sounds like a B-24, but there aren't any training flights scheduled for this area today. The sound grew louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from the west, from deeper in the mountains. But we couldn't see anything. The sky was empty, just brilliant blue and scattered clouds. Then the sound changed. The steady drone shifted to a rougher note, engines under stress. The pitch rose and fell irregularly, the way an aircraft sounds when the pilot is fighting for control. That plane's in trouble, Morrison said, standing up and shielding his eyes against the sun. We searched the sky desperately. The sound was loud now, so close it seemed like the aircraft should be right on top of us. I could hear individual engine variations, could almost feel the vibration of those massive propellers cutting through thin mountain air. But there was nothing there. No plane, no shadow, no contrail. Just empty sky and the overwhelming sound of a bomber in distress. Then, impossibly, we heard the impact. A tremendous crash echoed through the valley. Metal tearing, explosions. the unmistakable sound of an aircraft destroying itself against mountainside. The sound came from somewhere to our north, maybe 2 miles away, in a steep walled canyon we'd planned to search that afternoon. Morrison and I looked at each other in shock. "Move!" he shouted. We abandoned our gear and headed toward the sound at a run, or as much of a run as you can manage at high altitude over rough terrain. The crash had sounded massive, violent. If anyone survived, they'd need immediate help. It took us 45 minutes of hard climbing to reach the canyon where the sound had originated. We were both breathing hard, our lungs burning in the thin air. The canyon was empty. No wreckage, no fire, no debris, no scorched earth or broken trees. Nothing. Morrison walked the canyon floor slowly, examining every inch. I climbed partway up the walls, looking for impact marks or scattered metal. We searched for 2 hours. "This is impossible," Morrison finally said. "We both heard that crash. It was real. It was close. There should be wreckage everywhere." I didn't have an answer. We'd both heard it clearly, not just engine sounds, but the actual impact, the destruction of an aircraft. Yet there was no physical evidence it had happened. We returned to camp shaken and confused. Dietrich and Kovacs had returned earlier and were preparing dinner. They could tell immediately that something was wrong. When we explained what we'd heard, Kovacs set down his coffee slowly. "You heard it too?" "What do you mean, too?" I asked. "This afternoon, around 1500 hours, Frank and I heard aircraft engines. Sounded close, like a plane was flying right through the valley. But we never saw anything. We figured it was an echo effect, sound carrying weird through the mountains." Dietrich nodded. "We've both heard stories from other climbers, people hearing phantom aircraft in these mountains. We always thought it was just stories, urban legends." Morrison pulled out a worn notebook. "I've been keeping records," he admitted. "Unofficial, understand. Over the last 3 years, I've documented 17 separate reports from reliable sources, rangers, experienced climbers, even a few pilots, all describing similar phenomena. Aircraft sounds with no visible source, usually in this general area. Why didn't you report this?" I asked. "Report what? Strange sounds in the mountains? Command would think I'd gone mountain crazy. Besides, I didn't really believe it until today." He paused. "But we both heard that crash, Webb. That was real. That night, none of us slept well. I kept hearing phantom engine sounds in my mind, unable to shake the memory of that impact that left no trace. Around 0200 hours, Kovacs shook me awake. 'Sir, you need to see this.' I crawled out of my sleeping bag and followed him outside. The night was clear, the moon nearly full, casting silver light across the snow-covered peaks. Dietrich and Morrison were already standing outside the tent, looking west toward the high peaks. Following their gaze, I saw it. Lights, moving through the mountains at altitude. Not stars. These were lower, brighter, moving in formation. 4 distinct points of light, maintaining consistent spacing. "Navigation lights," Dietrich whispered, "on a 4-engine bomber." We watched the lights traverse the valley, moving slowly from south to north. They followed a flight path that would take them directly over the canyon where we'd heard the crash earlier. "That's suicide," Morrison said. "No pilot would fly that route at night. The peaks are over 14,000 feet. The clearance is too tight." But the lights kept coming, steady and deliberate. As they approached the narrow section of the canyon, we heard the engines again. That same 4-engine drone we'd heard earlier in the day. The lights entered the canyon. For a moment, they were visible between the towering walls. Then, exactly where we'd heard the crash, the lights suddenly dropped. A rapid descent that no aircraft could survive. We waited for the impact sound, the explosion, the fire. Nothing. Complete silence. The lights simply vanished. Morrison's hand was shaking as he wrote in his notebook, documenting the time and description. "That's Chen's plane," he said quietly. "I'd bet my life on it. That's the route he would have taken. And that canyon, that's where he went down. But we searched there," I protested. "There's no wreckage." "Not anymore," Dietrich said. But maybe there was. 2 months of heavy snow, avalanches, the natural movement of ice and rock in these mountains. Wreckage could be buried under 50 feet of snow by now. Or it could have slid into a crevasse. It was a logical explanation. But it didn't explain the lights. It didn't explain why we'd heard the crash during the day when there was no aircraft visible. It didn't explain why the same event seemed to be replaying over and over. "We're not dealing with a crash site," I said slowly, the realization forming as I spoke. "We're dealing with something else. Something that's somehow recording what happened here and playing it back." Kovacs, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "My grandmother came from the old country, Poland. She used to tell stories about places where violent deaths occurred. She said the trauma leaves a mark on the land itself, like a scar on reality. And sometimes, under the right conditions, you can still see the original event replaying." "A residual haunting," Dietrich said. "I've heard similar stories from European climbers. Battlefields where soldiers still march. Mountains where fatal climbing accidents repeat themselves every year on the same date." Morrison looked at me. "So what do we tell command? That we found Chen's plane but only as a ghost? That won't go over well." I made a decision that night. Whatever command thought, we needed to find physical evidence of what happened to Chen and his crew. Not just for official reports, but for the families. For closure. The next morning, we focused our search on the canyon where we'd heard the crash and seen the lights disappear. If the plane went down there, and I was now convinced it had, then wreckage existed somewhere beneath the snow. Morrison used his ranger training to read the terrain. "This canyon has a natural chute effect," he explained. "Heavy snow accumulates on those upper ridges, then slides down in avalanches. If a plane crashed here in mid-February, during peak avalanche season, the wreckage would have been buried and potentially moved downslope." We spent 3 days probing the snowpack with long metal rods, looking for anything solid that shouldn't be there. It was exhausting work at high altitude, and we found nothing but rock and ice. Then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, Kovacs hit something. "Here," he called out. "I've got something solid, wrong density for rock." We converged on his position and began carefully digging. 50 feet down, through layers of compacted snow and ice, we found it. A section of aluminum skin, crumpled and torn. Aircraft metal. U.S. Army Air Force markings were still visible, though badly damaged. "This is from a B-24, I confirmed, running my hand over the familiar construction. "This is Chen's plane." Over the next 2 days, we uncovered more debris. Small pieces, scattered over a wide area. The impact had been catastrophic. We found fragments of instruments, pieces of the bomb bay doors, sections of wing structure. And finally, we found personal effects. A navigator's slide rule, a gunner's glove, a wallet belonging to Lieutenant Marcus Chen himself, still containing a photo of his family. But we found no human remains. The force of the impact, combined with months of harsh mountain conditions, had left nothing behind except these scattered mechanical and personal artifacts. Morrison documented everything meticulously. We marked the location with survey stakes and took extensive photographs. This would be enough for an official recovery team to locate the site and complete a proper investigation. But the question remained. Why were we still hearing and seeing the crash replaying? The 4th night of our expanded search, we got our answer. We'd moved our camp closer to the crash site. Around midnight, the phenomenon occurred again. The engine sounds, growing louder, the aircraft apparently descending into the canyon. But this time, we were close enough to perceive something we'd missed before. As the phantom aircraft passed overhead, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. Not gradual, a sharp, immediate cold that seemed to penetrate to my bones. And I heard something beyond the engine noise. Voices. The crew communicating in those final moments. Altitude dropping too fast. Can't maintain. We're going in. Brace for impact. The voices were distant, distorted, like a radio transmission with heavy static. But they were unmistakably real, or at least, as real as any of this was. Then came the impact. This time, being so close I felt it as much as heard it. A vibration through the ground, through the air, through my chest. A momentary sensation of catastrophic violence. Then silence. The cold receded. The normal sounds of the mountain night returned, wind through rocks, the distant crack of shifting ice. Kovacs was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down his face. "Those men," he said quietly. "They're still dying. Over and over. Every night." Dietrich looked shaken. "We need to do something. We can't just leave them like this." "What can we do?" Morrison asked. "We can't change the past, can't prevent the crash. It already happened." But I thought I understood. The crew was trapped somehow in their final moments, unable to move on. The trauma of their deaths had created this loop, this endless replay of their final flight. "We found them," I said. "We recovered evidence. We can tell their families what happened. Maybe that's what they need, to be found, to be remembered, to not be listed as just missing anymore." It sounded naive, even to my own ears. But it was all we had. Retaliation to Peterson Field with inputting Peterson Field with our documentation and the recovered artifacts. Command dispatched a full recovery team to the site. Over the next month, they systematically excavated the crash zone and recovered more substantial pieces of the B-24. The official report confirmed what we'd suspected. Lieutenant Chen's aircraft had encountered unexpected severe weather, a sudden mountain storm that formed fastest than forecasts predicted. He'd attempted to navigate through the narrow canyon, but had been caught by downdrafts and had lost control. The impact had been instantaneous and unsurvivable. The families were notified. Funeral services were held. The crew was honored as casualties of war, their sacrifice acknowledged. Their names were added to memorial walls alongside thousands of others who died in training or combat. I thought that would be the end of it. That recognition and proper burial, even without recovered remains, would somehow release the phantom replay from the mountain. But 2 months later, I received a letter from Bill Morrison. "Webb," he wrote, "I need to tell you something I didn't mention during our search. The phantom bomber. It's been reported in these mountains since 1938, 5 years before Chen's crash. I found references in old ranger logs, climber journals, even Native American oral histories from the area. People have been hearing that aircraft for generations." I read the letter 3 times, trying to process the implications. If the phenomenon predated Chen's actual crash, then we weren't witnessing a residual haunting of his specific accident. We were witnessing something else, something that had been present in those mountains long before any aircraft existed to create such sounds. I wrote back immediately, requesting more information. Morrison sent me copies of historical documents he'd collected. The evidence was compelling and disturbing. A climbing expedition in 1921 reported hearing mechanical thunder in that same canyon, describing sounds that clearly matched aircraft engines, despite this being years before regular aviation in the area. A prospector in 1893 wrote about spirit winds that roar like trains, moving through the high passes. And most remarkably, a Ute medicine man interviewed in 1876 spoke of the Sky Warrior's Path, a route through the mountains where the spirits of dead warriors would fly, reenacting their final battles in the clouds. The implications were profound. The mountains weren't haunted by Chen's crash. Chen's crash had been drawn to a location that was already marked by some kind of phenomenon, a place where the boundary between normal reality and something else had always been thin. Perhaps the strange compass readings, the radio interference, the swallowing of sound that other pilots had reported. Perhaps all of that was this phenomenon affecting their aircraft. And perhaps Chen, like others before him, had been pulled into this space, had crashed not just due to weather, but because the mountain itself had somehow reached out and claimed him. It was an impossible thought, scientifically absurd. And yet, it fit the evidence better than any conventional explanation. I requested a transfer back to Peterson Field and began conducting quiet research. Over the next year, I documented every reported aircraft incident in the Colorado Rockies. I interviewed pilots, studied weather patterns, mapped crash locations. A pattern emerged. Roughly every 3 to 5 years, an aircraft would go missing or crash in the same general region, what I started calling the convergence zone. The incidents weren't always fatal, and they weren't always unexplained, but the frequency was statistically significant. That area claimed aircraft at a rate far higher than similar terrain elsewhere in the Rockies. Most disturbing was discovering that the reports of phantom aircraft sounds had actually increased since Chen's crash, as if his tragic accident had somehow strengthened the phenomenon, given it more energy to manifest. Other pilots started reporting the same experiences we'd had, hearing aircraft engines with no visible source, seeing navigation lights that disappeared, feeling sudden temperature drops and compass malfunctions in that specific area. Command continued to dismiss these reports as pilot nerves, equipment malfunction, or misidentification of natural phenomena. They'd established that the region had unusual acoustic properties and that sound could carry in unexpected ways through the mountain valleys, creating auditory illusions. It was a rational explanation, but it didn't account for everything we'd experienced. Abbas, in July 1944, I was reassigned to fly training missions again. The war was intensifying, and experienced instructors were badly needed. I'd spent enough time investigating mysteries that Command thought it was time I returned to my primary duties. I agreed, but with one condition. I wanted to fly through the convergence zone myself, to experience it from the air, not just from the ground, to understand what Chen and the others had encountered. Command reluctantly approved a solo navigation training flight that would take me through the area. They assigned me a B-24, similar to what Chen had been flying. Same aircraft type, same general route, though with explicit instructions to maintain safe altitude and avoid the narrower canyon passages. I took off on a clear morning in late July. The weather forecast was perfect, stable conditions, minimal wind, excellent visibility. Everything Chen hadn't had on his final flight. The flight to the convergence zone was routine. The B-24 handled beautifully, all 4 engines running smoothly, all instruments reading normally. I was 1,000 feet above the highest peaks, well clear of any terrain hazards. Then, I entered the zone. The change was immediate and unmistakable. My compass started spinning randomly. The radio filled with static that sounded almost like voices, not clear enough to understand, but definitely speech-like patterns. The altimeter began fluctuating wildly despite my maintaining steady altitude. And I heard them. The phantom engines. Not from outside the aircraft, from inside my own head. The sound of another B-24 flying in formation with me matching my speed and heading exactly. I could hear it so clearly I could identify which engines were running slightly rough, could almost feel the vibration of its propellers. I looked out the cockpit windows. Nothing there. Just empty sky and mountain peaks far below. "This is Webb to Peterson Control," I radioed. "Experiencing instrument malfunctions in Sector 7. Request guidance." Nothing but static in response. The radio was completely dead. Then the temperature in the cockpit dropped. I could see my breath fogging in air that had been comfortably warm seconds before. Frost formed on the inside of the windows. My hands started going numb on the controls. And I saw them, not with my eyes, with something else. A form of perception I didn't have words for. The other aircraft. Flying parallel to mine, maybe 50 feet off my starboard wing. A B-24 Liberator, identical to the one I was flying, but translucent, ghostly, existing in some space between solid reality and pure imagination. I could see the crew through the ghost aircraft's fuselage. 10 men at their stations: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, 5 gunners. They were going through their duties mechanically, checking instruments, adjusting controls, scanning for threats. They didn't seem to see me. They were locked in their own reality, their own final flight. Then the weather hit them. Storm clouds materialized around the phantom aircraft, massive thunderheads that appeared from nowhere. The ghost plane started bucking in turbulence. I watched the pilot fighting the controls, watched the crew bracing themselves. My own aircraft remained in clear skies. The storm existed only for them, only in whatever dimension they inhabited. The Phantom B-24 began losing altitude, descending toward the mountains below. The pilot was trying to climb, but the downdrafts were too powerful. They were going down, inexorably, toward the same canyon where we'd found the wreckage. I couldn't watch. I couldn't help. I could only witness as history replayed itself in that impossible space between realities. The phantom aircraft disappeared into the canyon. I didn't see the impact, but I felt it. A psychic shock that resonated through everything. A moment of pure horror and grief and finality. Then silence. The strange perception faded. My instruments returned to normal. The temperature climbed back to comfortable levels. The phantom engines ceased their drone. I was alone in clear skies over the Rocky Mountains, exactly where I should be, flying a perfectly functional aircraft. But I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the controls. I filed my flight report honestly, described everything I'd experienced: the instrument malfunctions, the temperature drop, the phantom aircraft, all of it. I expected command to ground me, to question my fitness for duty, perhaps to recommend psychological evaluation. Instead, they classified the report and called me in for a private meeting with a colonel I'd never met before. "Lieutenant Webb," he said, "you're not the first pilot to report these experiences. You're just the first one honest enough or foolish enough to document them officially." He opened a file folder, thick with documents. The military has been aware of unexplained aerial phenomena for years. Most of it gets dismissed, buried, or explained away. But some of it, particularly in certain geographic locations, defies conventional explanation. "The convergence zone," I said. He nodded. "Among other places. We've documented similar phenomena over the Bermuda Triangle, in the South Pacific, over certain sections of the Himalayas. Locations where aircraft and their crews experience things that shouldn't be possible." "What causes it?" The colonel shrugged. "We don't know. Geographic anomalies, magnetic irregularities, dimensional thin spots where different realities overlap. The science doesn't exist yet to explain it. Maybe it never will. And you're okay with that? With losing aircraft and crews to something we don't understand?" "No," he said firmly. Which is why we route training flights around these areas when possible. Why we mark them as hazardous zones on our maps. Why we brief experienced pilots about the potential for unusual phenomena. But we can't completely avoid them. And we certainly can't explain to the public or to Congress that certain mountain ranges are haunted by ghost bombers. He closed the file. You've served well, Webb. Your documentation of the Chen crash site brought closure to families. Your research has helped us identify the boundaries of the phenomenon more precisely. But I'm advising you to let this go now. Return to your duties. Train your pilots. Win the war. Leave the mysteries unsolved. It was good advice. I tried to follow it. The war ended in 1945. I remained in the Air Force for another 15 years, eventually retiring as a colonel myself. I trained hundreds of pilots, flew dozens of different aircraft types, served in Korea and in various peacetime commands. But I never forgot what I saw over the Rockies, never stopped thinking about Chen and his crew, trapped in their final moments, replaying their deaths endlessly in that space between worlds. I returned to Colorado in 1973, after retirement. Drove up to the mountains with Bill Morrison, who was still working as a ranger at age 70. We hiked into the convergence zone together, two old men struggling with altitude and age. The area was unchanged, still remote, still avoided by wildlife, still emanating that subtle wrongness that made your skin crawl. Do people still report the phenomena? I asked. Morrison nodded. Every few years, hikers hearing aircraft engines, climbers seeing lights in the sky. The stories continue. Will it ever stop? I don't think so, he said. Whatever happened here, whatever Chen flew into, whatever claimed him and the others, it's permanent. A scar on reality that won't heal. We stood there for a while in silence, two witnesses to something beyond explanation, paying our respects to men who died in service to their country, and then couldn't even rest in death. I'm 92 years old now as I record this in 2005. The military still classifies most of the documentation about the convergence zone. But occasionally, I hear from young pilots who've experienced similar phenomena, who've heard the ghost bomber, seen the lights, felt that impossible cold. I tell them what I learned. Some mysteries don't have solutions. Some tragedies echo beyond their moment of occurrence. Some places hold memories of violence so powerful that reality itself becomes scarred. The ghost bomber of the Rockies still flies its final mission. Lieutenant Marcus Chen and his crew still navigate through impossible weather, still fight to maintain control, still crash into that narrow canyon. They'll fly that route forever, trapped in a loop of their own death, witnesses to their own tragedy. And those of us who've seen them, who've shared that terrible moment of perception, we carry their memory forward, even if we can't set them free. Some ghosts aren't meant to be exorcised. Some are meant to be remembered, to be honored, to remind us that the world is stranger and more terrible than we imagine, and that the men and women who serve their country sometimes pay prices that extend beyond death itself. The mountains remember, the sky remembers, and so do I.